Calamity Jane might just be one of the most famous women to ever come out of the Old West. Over the years, she's popped up in everything from dime novels to Hollywood movies, one of the greatest TV shows of all time, Deadwood, and even a Doris Day musical. And for good reason. If you just go off the legend alone, this is a woman who scouted for the army. She rode for the Pony Express, fought hostile natives, and somewhere along the way, still found time to get married to the legendary Wild Bill Hickok. Only problem is, almost none of that is true. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Separating fact from fiction when it comes to the real Calamity Jane. How did a poor orphan girl from Missouri become one of the biggest celebrities on the frontier? Where exactly did that nickname come from, Calamity? And if she wasn't Wild Bill Hickok's secret bride, then why in the hell is she buried right next to him up in Deadwood? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
Martha Jane Canary was born near Princeton, Missouri, sometime around the year 1856. Probably. She'd later claim she was born on May 1st, 1852, but the census of 1860 tells a much different story. And spoiler alert, but this certainly ain't the only time when Jane's version of events don't exactly line up with the paperwork. Not by a long shot. Her father Robert was a farmer/gambler with a bit of a drinking habit. And her mother Charlotte, well, unfortunately, she really didn't leave much of a historical record. What little we do know is that she and Robert got married up in Iowa when she was just 15 years old. By the time she was 20, she already had 3 children, with Jane being the oldest. Family headed west in 1865, bound for the gold diggings, but sadly, that's also when everything started falling apart. You see, somewhere near the mining town of Blackfoot, Montana, is where Jane's mother Charlotte died of pneumonia. Robert and the kids drifted on down to Utah, where he likely followed his wife to an early grave the very next year. And I say likely, but truth be told, there's really not much information regarding Jane's early life, including where or when her father kicked the bucket. No death certificate, no burial record, nothing. He probably died in Utah, probably sometime around the year 1867. Either way, though, the result was the same. Martha Jane Canary was an orphan before she even hit puberty, with 5 younger siblings and not a dime to her name. And what happened next is just as murky as her daddy's death. In fact, the only thing we know for certain is that by 1869, Jane had made her way to the railroad town of Piedmont, over in Carter County, Wyoming. And the only reason we know that much is because she turned up on the territorial census. As for what she was doing there, or who she was living with, your guess is as good as mine. From Piedmont, the trail goes completely cold for the better part of 5 years. And then when she finally pops back up, she's working as what people in those days politely referred to as a camp follower. Now, if you're not familiar with the term camp follower, it was basically anyone who earned a living traveling with the army. A cook, a nurse, maybe even a seamstress. And sometimes it just meant prostitute. According to historian Richard Edelane, there's really not any hard evidence that she was engaged in sex work. But then again, at the same time, the men she traveled with clearly treated her as being available. Also, some of the places where she worked at, including a hog ranch just outside of Fort Laramie, were known whorehouses. There was another guy by the name of Clement Lounsbury who described Jane around this same time period as working as a prostitute. But then again, there was another guy, Ben Arnold, who recalled her presence amongst the Union Pacific towns and noted that she, quote, became a follower of the freighting teams and learned to be a good driver, end of quote. So there you have it, 2 different accounts, one claiming that she was a lady of the night and the other a teamster, which does sort of line up with historian James McLaird and his book Calamity Jane, in which he stated, quote, Martha's work as a dance hall girl and prostitute in the hog ranches located in the vicinity of Fort Laramie probably mirrored her early life along the Union Pacific, but it is misleading to portray young Martha as a regular occupant in a house of prostitution. If her behavior during this period was characteristic, she would have only worked intermittently at the road ranch. Often Martha roamed freely, and sometimes she established lengthy relationships with her male companions. End of quote. So in other words, sometimes she worked as a soiled dove, and sometimes she was just engaged in other types of employment. Now, her means of survival notwithstanding, Jane's legend really kicked off in earnest in May of 1875. That's the day when an army surgeon over at Fort Laramie, a guy with a curious name of Valentine McGillicuddy, spotted a woman strutting across the parade ground wearing spurs, chaps, and a sombrero. Naturally, the doc was curious as to who she was, so he asked around. And according to him, a Lieutenant Colonel Richard Irving Dodge identified Jane as sort of a regimental mascot. One who, in Dodge's own words, didn't know the meaning of the word morals. Now, speaking of Dodge, he and several of his soldiers would take a scientific expedition to the Black Hills during the summer of 1875, the Newton-Jenny expedition. And this was just in order to figure out how much gold was actually up there. And wouldn't you know it, just a few days out, somebody noticed an unaccounted for young private trailing the column. Turns out it was just Jane. She had attached herself to the civilian teamsters and was riding along dressed head to toe in the uniform of a U.S. soldier. Now, it just so happened that one of the expedition's surgeons, a guy known as J.K. Lane, was moonlighting as a correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. He filed a dispatch not long thereafter, in which he referred to Jane as Calam. Quote, Calam is dressed in a suit of soldier's blue and straddles a mule equal to any professional black snake swinger in the army. End of quote. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the very first known reference to the nickname Calamity. But as to how she actually got the nickname, that's an entirely different story. According to Jane in her own autobiography, she rescued a Captain Egan from hostiles up in Wyoming. And when she hauled the wounded officer up on her horse, Egan declared her Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains. It's a great story, but there's just no evidence whatsoever that any such thing ever happened. Her longtime friend George Hosher, on the other hand, who would go on to serve as a pallbearer at her funeral, told a very different story to the Washington Post in 1906. According to Hoshier, she picked up the name in Cheyenne around 1875, just simply due to being a walking disaster. If she rented a buggy from the livery stable, she'd wreck it. If she climbed up on a fence rail, the rail would somehow buck her off. So the editor of the Cheyenne Daily Sun, a guy by the name of Polton, started calling her Calamity Jane, and I guess it stuck. I'll let you decide which version to believe, but me personally, I do think Hoshier's story has more of a ring of truth to it. Whereas the Captain Egan story has the ring of a 19th century dime novel. And keep in mind, that is the same autobiography in which Jane claimed to have scouted for General Custer and ridden for the Pony Express, neither of which holds up to even the slightest scrutiny. Now, she even claimed to have joined Custer over at Fort Russell in 1870, but Custer was never even stationed there. Like I said, take pretty much everything in Jane's autobiography with an entire wagon load of salt. But then again, you could also say pretty much the same thing for every other memoir from the Old West. They're all tall on legend, but short on facts. Now, about a year after the Newton-Jennings expedition, Jane returned to the Black Hills via a wagon train out of Fort Laramie. And the story of how she ended up on said wagon train is pretty much on brand. According to Joseph White-Eye Anderson, who was also traveling with the wagons, an Army officer over at Fort Laramie personally asked the train to take Jane with him. Apparently, Jane had been on one hell of a bender and gotten herself locked up in the post guardhouse. In Anderson's words, quote, very drunk and near naked. Now, as far as what exactly Jane had been drinking that weekend, I couldn't tell you, but to borrow a line from HBO's Deadwood, I reckon her only requirement was that it hadn't already been previously swallowed. Either way, the Army basically wanted her gone, right? And the wagon train happened to be leaving, so 2 birds, 1 cup. Now, as fate would have it, Wild Bill Hickok was also part of this wagon train. That's right, the supposed love of Jane's life, the man she'd one day be buried next to, and here they were having their grand introduction on account of an Army garrison being tired of Jane's nonsense. And I hate to break it to you, but the relationship itself really wasn't much more romantic than that initial meeting. You see, at the time, Hickok was newly married, having wed a circus proprietor named Agnes Lake just a few months prior over in Cheyenne. And per historian Joseph Rosa, the contemporary accounts do show a genuine affection between Bill and Agnes. As for Jane, though, Hickok seems to have regarded her mostly as a traveling companion at best, and as an embarrassment at worst. And then, of course, he was killed over in Deadwood just a few weeks later. So in other words, the two of them had only known each other for maybe a month and a half, tops. Nevertheless, Jane would spend the next 27 years claiming a certain closeness that people who actually knew Hickok would later deny. Hey, just real quick, if you're enjoying this latest edition of the Wild West Extravaganza, you might also want to check out the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. For just $5 a month, you get every episode ad-free, plus early releases. You also get access to bonus content you can't find anywhere else, including the really early embarrassing stuff. And on top of all that, 20% of every single dollar earned through Patreon goes directly to charity. So not only will you be supporting your favorite podcaster, but you'll also be helping to make the world a better place. That's patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Or just click the link down below that says Patreon. Now, since we're on the subject of the Hickok romance, there is another chapter of the story that I do think is worth addressing. You see, on Mother's Day of 1941, a lady calling herself Jean Hickok Burkhart McCormick went on a national radio program called We the People and announced that she was the secret daughter of Wild Bill and Calamity Jane. And she even had the receipts, a diary, and a packet full of letters, supposedly written by Jane to her long-lost daughter, including details of the alleged 1873 marriage. The story was sensational, the documents looked plausible enough, and writers and Hollywood filmmakers ran with it for the next 50 years. The only problem is, it was completely fabricated. It wasn't until the 1990s that researchers, including the aforementioned James McLaird, finally took the diary apart piece by piece. For starters, the letters were very well written, which is a bit odd considering that the real Jane Canary was basically illiterate. And even better, the diary actually describes Jane meeting Jesse James after his death, at which point, and I swear I'm not making this up, according to her, she even saw Jesse sing a song at his own funeral. So no, there was no secret marriage, and Jean McCormick was most definitely not the daughter of Calamity and Wild Bill. Now that said, the real Jane did have at least one child, a daughter named Jessie, born in October of 1887. And she did legally marry, up in Ohio in 1888, to a railroad brakeman by the name of William Steers. I wish I could tell you this was a high point in Jane's life, but sadly, it was anything but. Steers beat her pretty often, and Jane had him thrown in jail on at least 3 different occasions for abuse. In the end, the marriage itself didn't even last a full year. As far as I'm aware, there's no divorce on record, but Steers just sort of fades out of the picture, and that's that. In the years that followed, Jane would go on to live with several other men, including a guy named Clinton Burke. In fact, she'd end up carrying Burke's name for the rest of her life, despite there not being any type of official marriage records. As for Burke, he too seems to have disappeared from history after robbing his employer over in Deadwood and skipping town. As to whether or not he and Jane had any contact afterwards, I honestly don't know. Now, at this point, you're probably curious as to what Jane actually did for a living, other than occasionally selling her body. I mean, we spent most of the episode talking about what she didn't do, like scouting for the army or marrying Wild Bill Hickok. So how exactly was she keeping herself fed? Well, the short answer is basically any way she could. You see, over the course of Jane's life, she worked as everything from a bullwhacker, a cook, a waitress, a laundress, an ox team driver, and even a dance hall girl. Which begs the question, when Jane was in Deadwood, did she ever brush shoulders with that cocksucker Al Swearengen? And the answer is almost certainly yes. If you've ever seen the TV show Deadwood, Canary and Swearengen weren't exactly the best of friends, but in real life, she actually worked for the man. Per historian James McLaird, quote, "Some accounts identify Swearengen's gym as the establishment where Martha initially danced in Deadwood. That summer, the summer of 1876, he had only 3 women available for dancing, Mrs. Swearengen, Kitty Arnold, and Calamity Jane." End of quote. McLaird then goes on to say that Jane, in addition to dancing, also helped to recruit talent. Hell, at one point, she even worked for the Bella Union, doing more of the same. This was in the early 1870s, though. By the 1890s, she was running her own restaurant over in Castle City, Montana. And then later on, of course, she just made her living simply off of her name, performing at museums and selling photographs. Basically just whatever work was available, usually for however long it took her to save up for the next bender. Now, just to circle back to the topic of Jane's children, turns out Jessie wasn't her first. You see, back in November of 1882, while living with a rancher named Frank King over near Miles City, Jane gave birth to a baby boy that the local papers dubbed Little Calamity. A local freighter would even recall watching Jane lavishing the baby with kisses while calling him, quote, "Muzzy's woodle snuzzy darlin'." End of quote. And if that just melted your heart a little bit, well, brace yourself, because Little Calamity is believed to have died in infancy. Jessie, though, the one I mentioned earlier, she did survive. And for the first decade or so of her life, Jane just pretty much dragged her all over the West. It wasn't until 1895 that Jane came to Deadwood, telling people she needed money to enroll Jessie over in a convent school in Sturgis. Her old friends ended up throwing a benefit on her behalf, and by all accounts, it was a success. Or at least it was until Jane started buying drinks for the crowd. By the end of the night, most of the money was already gone, and per at least one eyewitness, Jane was roaring drunk. Nevertheless, she did eventually scrape together enough money to get Jessie enrolled by January of 1896. In fact, it was right around that same time that writer M.L. Fox interviewed Jane and got to meet little Jessie, describing her as neatly dressed and shy, with a bright face and good manners. As for Jane, she told Fox, quote, "She's all I got to live for. She's my only comfort." End of quote. Sadly, though, their relationship wouldn't last. Jesse bounced in and out of school, as well as in and out of Jane's custody, until finally in 1899, a cowboy named Robert Dorset, the last of Jane's so-called husbands, took the girl to go live with his mother over in Lewiston, Montana. And that was pretty much it. They were briefly reunited in early 1903, but on her deathbed, Jane would admit that she and Jesse had become estranged. So with all that in mind, what became of Jesse? Well, that's a sad story all of its own. Turns out she grew up so disconnected from her mother that for a while she actually believed Calamity Jane was her grandmother. And then later on, likely at the urging of that fraudster G. McCormick, she even claimed that Jane and Belle Starr were her aunts, neither of which was true. Still though, when she passed away in California in 1980, her death certificate did correctly list her mother's maiden name as Canary. Now in fairness to Jane, it wasn't all just drunken binges and bad marriages. You see, there is at least one part of the legend that holds up, and it's the fact that Jane was said to have been extremely generous. When a smallpox epidemic tore through Deadwood in 1878, most of the residents wouldn't go anywhere near the sick, but Jane did. She nursed prospectors through the worst of it with very little in the way of thanks or compensation, but apparently the good folks at Deadwood never forgot it. Years later, when Jane was finally buried, the guy who closed the lid on her coffin was one of her former patients. And that wasn't just a one-time thing, by the way. 2 years prior, when a miner named Jack McCarthy had broken his leg and was laid up alone in a cabin between Central City and Lead, Jane went around all the dance halls asking the patrons to give her money instead of buying her drinks. She then used all that cash to purchase supplies and rode out to nurse McCarthy back to health. Matter of fact, a writer named Lewis Freeman, who spent time with Jane near the end of her life, stated, quote, "Hers was the sunniest of souls and the most generous. She was poor all of her life from giving things away, and I have heard her last illness was contracted in nursing some poor sot that she found in the gutter." End of quote. And yeah, you heard that correctly. There is at least a chance that Calamity Jane's final illness came from one last act of charity. Maybe. We'll get to that here in just a minute. Unfortunately, though, the last 20 or so years of her life was mostly just a slow decline into the bottle, punctuated here and there by brief flashes of celebrity. Like I mentioned earlier, by the 1890s, she was just scraping by, mostly through selling copies of that little autobiography, along with photographs. Then in 1901, a newspaper writer named Josephine Brake tracked Jane down over in Montana and hauled her back east to appear at the Pan American Exposition over in Buffalo. On paper, it sounded like a rescue, but in reality, it was closer to a shakedown. Brake was supposedly clearing $25 a week off the arrangement, whereas all Jane was receiving was about 30 cents. So she did what Calamity Jane always did. She drank up her wages, jumped ship to a rival, an outfit known as the Indian Congress, which, fun fact, also featured the great Geronimo, and then she got herself arrested for public drunkenness. And finally, when Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show came to town, a desperate Jane burst into the showman's tent stating, quote, "They've got me buffaloed. I want to go back. There's no place for me in the East. Stake me a railroad ticket and the price of meals and send me home." End of quote. Now, just for clarification, contrary to popular belief, Jane never actually performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. But they did go back quite a ways. In fact, just a few months prior, when the papers reported that a sick and destitute Calamity Jane had landed in a Montana poorhouse, Cody was among those who mailed in donations to get her back on her feet. So when she came begging for a ticket home, he once again reached into his own pocket. Train fare, meal money, the whole 9 yards. He later remarked that she was no more tired of Buffalo than the Buffalo police were tired of her. As for that meal money, Jane allegedly drank it up before she even made it out of Chicago. By 1903, she had drifted back to the Dakotas, where an old friend took her in. And that friend just so happened to be Dora Dufresne, one of the most successful madams in the history of the Black Hills. She put Jane to work over in Belle Fourche, cooking and doing laundry for the Soiled Doves. And by all accounts, this was the most stable stretch of her final decade. A roof over her head, regular meals, and somebody who actually gave a damn. Just didn't last very long. You see, on August 1st, 1903, over in a hotel room in the little mining town of Terry, South Dakota, just a few miles outside of Deadwood, Martha Jane Canary died at around 46 years of age. The contemporary reports blamed inflammation of the bowels, along with pneumonia, but let's be honest, what really did her in was almost certainly 3 decades of hard drinking. And if Freeman was correct and that final illness really did come from nursing one last stranger, well, it was still the whiskey that left her with nothing to fight it with. Which brings us to the famous burial. Because yes, Calamity Jane really is buried beside Wild Bill Hickok up at Mount Moriah Cemetery, overlooking the town of Deadwood. And no, this was not in fulfillment of some dying frontier romance. According to statements from 4 of the very men who planned her funeral, Hickok had absolutely no use for her. And so burying her next to him for all eternity struck him as a fitting prank. In other words, one of the most romanticized grave sites in the American West, in all likelihood, is just a practical joke. Whether the joke is on Hickok or on Canary, well, yes, that depends on your sense of humor. So how should we remember Calamity Jane? Well, I think Captain Jack Crawford, a man who actually scouted for the Army under General Crook and who personally knew Jane, I think he put it best in his summary to the Anaconda Standard in April of 1904. According to him, she never scouted for anybody. She never fought Indians. She was simply a notorious character, dissolute and devilish, but one who possessed a generous streak that made her popular. As for Dora Dufresne, she'd later state that Canary, quote, knew better than anyone where she made her mistakes, and she didn't rate her virtues as highly as her friends did, end of quote. The myth may have turned her into a buckskin heroine, but the evidence, in my opinion at least, makes her into something a whole hell of a lot more interesting. A real flesh and blood human being, with all the contradictions that such a condition implies. Drunk and illiterate, generous and kind, abused and at times abusive, brave when it didn't much matter and absent when it did. She wasn't Joan of Arc, she wasn't Florence Nightingale, and she sure as hell wasn't Wild Bill's secret bride. She was Martha Jane Canary from Princeton, Missouri, the little girl who got dealt about the worst hand imaginable at 11 years of age. And then she played it out for another 35 years with a whole lot more nerve than sense. And I guess that's about all I've got on the great Calamity Jane. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to check out the Patreon for exclusive content and ad-free early access. And until next time, adios.